Hey everybody, welcome to another lesson of learning Japanese. In our previous video, we started covering the passive form construction in its grammatical usage, how to actually use the passive form construction in a sentence with a subject and a verb. And what we covered first was actually only one of two versions of the passive form, and that was the simple passive form, or otherwise known as the direct passive form. So to continue on with our coverage of the passive form, we're now going to move on to the second version, which is kind of the more complicated one and the one that is more detached to the English language's most common form of the passive form, basically. And what we're going to call the second version is the adversity passive form, or otherwise known as the indirect passive form. So we've already broken down the passive form, the general passive form, into two versions, the simple or the direct passive form, and now in this lesson the adversity passive form, or otherwise called the indirect passive form. Unfortunately, now that we're covering the second one, the second version, the adversity passive form, it is a bit more complicated than the simple passive form, such that we need to again break it down into two versions. And the two versions are going to be using the adversity passive form with transitive verbs, and then using the adversity passive form with intransitive verbs, because they do have different nuances to them, so we're going to cover them separately. And so in this lesson, we will cover first up the transitive verbs being used with the adversity passive form. And so basically, with transitive verbs being used with the adversity passive form, the subject of the sentence is going to be the person who was ultimately affected by the action that was occurred, and the person who performed the action, who would have been the subject of the sentence if this was an active form sentence, is performing what we should know to be a transitive verb, in which this is a verb that is done to another entity and not to yourself. And so we can kind of see how the transitive verbs being used with the adversity passive form is simpler than the intransitive verbs with the adversity passive form, because transitive verbs ultimately affect other people. So it makes perfect sense that the subject of the adversity passive form is going to be someone who is affected by an action that somebody else did to someone else. When we cover the intransitive verbs being used with the adversity passive form, someone is going to perform an action upon themselves, and somehow that is ultimately going to affect another person. But of course, we'll get more into that in the next lesson. So just to brush up on our comprehension of the passive form in general, when we have an active form sentence, we have the subject of the sentence as the entity that's performing the verb. On the other hand, in the simple passive form, for the subject of the sentence, we have the direct object of the verb. Or alternatively, for the subject of the sentence, we can have the indirect object of the verb. And so now with the adversity passive form, or the indirect passive form, what we're going to have as the subject of the sentence is not the entity that performed the verb, or the direct object of the verb, or the indirect object of the verb per se, but actually just the thing that is affected by the action. So for example, if we have the active form sentence, the thief stole my bag, well, in that sentence, the thief is the one performing the action, so it's going to be the subject of the active form sentence. If we turn that into the simple passive form, the bag will become the subject because it's the direct object of the action to steal. And if to steal was a verb that allowed for an indirect object, then maybe the indirect object would become the subject of the sentence instead in this passive form. But the verb to steal doesn't really allow for an indirect object to appear in the sentence. However, if we were to implement the adversity passive form, then we could kind of convey this nuance, because the subject of an adversity passive form sentence is going to be the one that is kind of adversely affected by the action. And we should be able to tell here that in the scenario of something being stolen, the victim of the action is almost always going to be the person who owned the stuff originally, who got stolen from. So in this adversity passive form, we can make the speaker the subject of the sentence, even though in the active form sentence, the speaker isn't explicitly stated to be an entity in the sentence, because all we did to denote the speaker's presence in the scenario was using the word my, which was technically just an adjective to describe the thing that was stolen. And so yeah, that is the rundown on how the adversity passive form is working in the Japanese language. It's going to be making the thing that was affected by the action of the sentence the subject of the sentence, and this is always going to carry a kind of sympathetic tone to it, such as the subject subject has been wronged, is a victim, so on. And so with that said, now let's just go into a couple of example sentences to get a really good look at how this actually works. And so for our first sentence, we have the very simple line, Sakabaru ni atama o utareta. And what this line is going to translate to is just basically, I was hit in the head by a ball. And so if we break down the sentence bit by bit, first up we have Sakabaru, which is going to be soccer ball basic, and the particle ni is going to follow right after it. So we kind of know now that this is the thing that performed the action, and it would be the subject of the sentence if this was the active form of the sentence. But since this is the adversity passive form, this is not going to be the subject of the sentence, it's just going to be the thing that performed the action upon the entity that was affected by the action, and thus that entity is going to be the subject of the sentence instead. Next up we have the noun atama, which is going to be head, and this is going to be the direct object of the verb, the action that occurred. And in order to denote that, we mark it right after with a O to be the direct object particle marker. And last but not least, to end the whole sentence and wrap it up, we need the actual verb, and that verb is going to be utsu, which means to hit. Here we're going to conjugate it into its passive form, and then we're going to change that in turn into the plain past tense. So utsu turns into utareta. And so we combine that all together and we have basically from or by a soccer ball, head was hit. But we need to add on some implications to the sentence here. Since the subject isn't explicitly stated, then we know that the subject is going to be the speaker of the sentence, which is me or I. And since we know the subject of the sentence now is me or I, then we can assume that the head that was hit was of course also mine. And so with that context then we can transform the translation of the sentence to I was hit in the head by a soccer ball. If we want to translate this more literally with the emphasis on the adversity of the sentence, then we could say something along the lines of I was adversely affected by my head being hit by a soccer ball. That literal translation right there should show how the construction of the grammar pattern is working, how the head is the direct object, the verb is to hit. There isn't quite an indirect object because the verb to hit doesn't really allow for an indirect object, so we use the adversity passive form to make the person affected the subject, and that's going to be me. And of course the noun or the entity that would have been the subject of the sentence if this was an active form sentence, the ball. So once again, altogether, Sakaboru ni atama o utareta is going to be I was adversely affected by my head being hit by a soccer ball, or more naturally, I was hit in the head by a soccer ball. For our next example sentence, we have another relatively simple sentence, and that line is going to be Koen de nimotsu o nusumareta. And what this line is going to translate to simply is just I had my luggage stolen at the park. Let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up we have koen, which is the noun that means park. We have de, marking it as the location in which an action happened. We have nimotsu, which is going to mean baggage or luggage. We have the direct object marker o right after nimotsu to make it the direct object of the action that's about to occur, and that action is going to be nusumu, and this means to steal. Nusumu is going to be the dictionary form of the verb, so if we want to make it into the passive form, we change it to nusumareru, and then in turn we're going to change that into the past plain tense because this happened in the past, and so then that's going to change into nusumareta. And so if we put that all together, this kind of just translates to literally at the park baggage was stolen, and this would be the completely correct finalized translation if not for one key distinction, and that's that the particle after nimotsu, the noun, is going to be o to mark it as the direct object of the sentence and not the subject of the sentence. If we had used instead of an o a wa or a ga right after nimotsu, that would have been a simple passive form sentence, but here we're using the adversity passive form, so since there is an o instead of a wa or ga, we know that that's not the subject. The subject is actually something that is implied, which is in turn going to be the speaker of the sentence now. And so instead of being the line at the park baggage was stolen, it's going to be at the park I was adversely affected by my baggage being stolen. And another important thing to note here is of course that we've actually dropped the entity, the noun that performed the action, because it has been, I guess, deemed irrelevant to the actual sentence. So that itself is not a mandatory thing for this grammar construct. The noun or the entity that performed the action that would have been the subject in the active form sentence does not necessarily have to appear in the adversity passive form of the sentence. So altogether, once again, koen de nimotsu o nusumareta is going to be I was adversely affected by my luggage being stolen at the park, or more naturalized, I had my luggage stolen at the park, or my luggage was stolen at the park, if you want to translate it without distinction between the simple passive form and the adversity passive form. For our last example sentence, we have the line 電車の中でジョージ・ワシントンは知らない人に靴を踏まれた. And what this line is going to translate to is basically, on the train, George Washington had his shoes stepped on by a stranger. So let's break down this sentence bit by bit. First up, we have the word densha, which is going to be the word for train. Right after densha, we have nonaka, and this is going to be the particle no, making use of the noun of a noun modification. So if densha means train and the word naka means inside, then densha no naka is going to be the inside of the train, or the train's inside. This is going to more naturally come out as on the train, even though we're inside the train technically when we're writing it, but of course English is saying that we're on the train. And so on the train is going to be the location, and we're going to need to mark that location if an action occurred there that we want to express, so we use the particle de right after that to mark that as the location. And now we introduce the subject or the topic of the sentence with the particle wa, so we have George Washington, that's going to be George Washington, with the wa right after it to mark him as the topic of the sentence. And now we're going to introduce what would have been the subject of the sentence if this sentence was the active form, so basically the person, the entity that performed the action, and that's going to be shiranai hito. And shiranai hito is going to be two words. It's going to be the word shiranai, and it's going to be the word hito. And shiranai is just going to be the nai form of the verb shiru, which means to know or to get to know. Then the word hito is just going to be persons. So shiranai is the nai form, the negative form of the verb to know. Then shiranai is going to be not know, basically, and then we apply that, and then we use that to modify hito, which is person, so it's just going to be basically a person that you don't know, a stranger. We're going to mark that stranger with the particle ni right after because we are expressing that that's the person that performed the action. So we're getting closer to explicitly stating the action, but first we're going to introduce the direct object of the action, and that is going to be the word kutsu, which is going to mean shoe or shoes. Then we're going to mark shoes with the direct object marker o, of course, and now we can finally introduce the verb that happened. And so we have the word fumareta, and so this is going to be the plain past passive form of the verb fumu, which just means basically to step on, to trample, something along those lines. And so if it's in the plain past passive form, then it's going to translate to basically was stepped on. And so if we take all of those elements and put it all together, then the sentence is going to read as basically George Washington had his shoes stepped on by a stranger on the train. Here, unlike the first two examples, we're actually explicitly stating the subject of the sentence because this sentence is describing something that happened to a third person, as in not yourself, so you can't really imply that it happened to George Washington without explicitly stating his name, unless there's already been a mountain of conversational stuff said prior to the sentence, but that's not the case in our example because we're just throwing an example sentence to you with no context. And so this construction of this example sentence is going to tell you exactly what you need to know. The wa particle is marking George Washington as the subject, so George Washington is going to be the person that was affected by the action adversely. Shiranai hito is marked by the particle ni, so that's going to be the person or the entity that performed the action and also would have been the subject if this was an active form sentence. We have kutsu, which is shoes, being marked by o to make it the direct object, so the direct object of the verb. And then lastly, we have the verb explicitly stated in its passive form, its plain past passive form. So once again, all together, densha no naka de George Washington wa shiranai hito ni kutsu o fumareta. So we should know exactly what this means just by piecing the information we know from this grammar pattern together. And it means George Washington had his shoes stepped on by a stranger on the bus. And so yeah, that concludes our coverage of the adversity passive form using transitive verbs. So this was a fair amount of information to take in, but we're not quite done. In our next coverage, we're going to cover how to use the adversity passive form with intransitive verbs, and we're also going to provide a little tidbit about how it all differs from certain grammar patterns that you might confuse this with.